Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about some of this recent news that we've had coming out about the Overwatch League and Blizzard Esports and how they have kind of gone about some of these things going forward into 2021, particularly with these layoffs and the rumors about the Overwatch League moving to a more online focus for the 2021 season and beyond. So first I want to talk about these layoffs, because these layoffs kind of set a very... they put a bad taste, I think, in a lot of people's mouths. And I think they also kind of set us up for the story that came out a few days ago from InVen Global about this kind of move to online, which I'll talk about here in a second. But I'm going to link in the description to an article by Jacob Wolf of .esports. Now, this is an article. Technically, this article came out after the news about the move to online, but these layoffs happened a few days prior to that. So that is something just to keep note of, that while it looks like it's from a different time afterwards, it's actually technically an earlier thing that happened about, I think, the day before. And so, but this Jacob Wolf article is a very good kind of recap of what happened, as well as kind of talking about what the problems with this are, which I do 100% agree with him. So, or, well, I won't say 100%. I agree with a lot of what he says, but I'm not going to read the whole article, but just kind of give you some of the key points that I think are important, but I think you should read the whole article if it sounds interesting to you. But just kind of the general idea of what happened. This past week, Activision Blizzard announced that it will lay off 190 people. 50 of those affected will be in its esports division, primarily responsible for the Overwatch League and Call of Duty League. Now, we know some of the people who've been laid off are observers. I believe I saw like a higher level person as well, some type of like producer or VP was laid off. So it's not just some of those lower level talent type people. It is also your kind of mid to upper range type of executive type of people who have also been laid off as well. And I think this was an interesting thing and a really kind of sad thing to see, because this is a story we've talked about several times in the past, that Activision Blizzard has been laying off people, especially a lot of people on the esports side of things. I think they also had a pretty big layoff of some big like story development people as well, either last year or a little bit before. So it is interesting to see what has been going on, but I think that it's a very important thing to talk about, because it is worrying seeing that there are these layoffs and they keep happening year after year after year, that we're getting these somewhat major layoffs coming from Blizzard and their esports side of things. And when they're not protecting a lot of their talent that are behind the scenes people, it is a bit of a worry. Observing is a very important part of the Overwatch League, and it's a very important part of the viewing process, and it's a very important part of the storytelling. And so cutting back on those observers is a little troublesome. And there are fewer games this season, so it does kind of make sense. Fewer games means fewer time watched, or less time watched. It also means more competition for how many people you have observing each of the games. So it does make sense from that kind of base level that you would have to cut back, but it's also less games in kind of an air quotes type of thing, because you have the tournaments, and it's 16 regular season games for every team, down from it's 12 fewer games per team. Technically last season's only down 5, but that's a lot of games, right? That's 100 games that you're cutting back on in the league, which is a lot. You're adding some more in that tournament, but the reality is you're cutting back on a lot of games. So in that regard, it kind of makes sense to be cutting back on some of the people that you have actually competing, but it doesn't solve the issues that we're seeing. We're still seeing issues of kind of money problems with teams like the LA Valiant. We have seen tons of stories about the LA Valiant. One of the big ones we've seen about them is that they have been trying, Immortals, who own this spot, have been trying to sell that team spot for a long time, and nobody wants to buy it, seemingly, because it is something that is difficult to do when the league seemingly has a big risk and is not as profitable as some of those organizations and teams would like it to be. But it is a bit worrisome. And Jacob Wolf goes in here a lot on some things I think are pretty important. One of the things he talks about is that the teams, luckily, in a sense, because of the fact that the Overwatch League had to move online, and the Call of Duty League, he talks about that as well in here, but I want to focus on the Overwatch League because that's the focus of my channel. Because they had to move online for the 2020 season, in most kind of cases, because of the move online, teams ended up saving themselves some money. They weren't renting out venues. They were able to basically have their players compete, and you're kind of able to bring in money without having to spend money elsewhere. Also of note, something I think is a huge change that helps some of your teams able to make their own money is the freedom now for teams to be able to have their own stores, sell their own merchandise directly, where they don't have to sell it through Fanatics. I think the Fanatics store is still going to exist, but they're giving teams now the ability to sell their own merchandise. Once again, a change that helps the actual teams themselves make money back from the investment that they made. They can sell their own merchandise. Yeah, you have to kind of produce that merchandise, but you're always selling shirts and jackets and stuff for a way higher price than you're producing them, because if you didn't, you would never make money off of them. It's just the way it works. So obviously that's a thing, and so that's a big change that I think benefits a lot of the teams. And so when you have all these layoffs, it is troublesome and it is worrisome to see that them cutting back on so many people, because it looks like a lack of investment in esports. And from everything that was talked about, most of the people who were let go were some of those live event in-person background people. And this is what led to this report from Inven Global, this second article, that the Overwatch League would be potentially retiring their homestand models and moving away from the in-person model into an online space. Now, this article was updated on March 17th with a statement from from Blizzard, where they said live events are still very much a part of both the Overwatch League and Call of Duty League strategies. We plan to get back to them as soon as it's safe to do so and logistically feasible. But what Inven Global has is that the Overwatch League will be focusing its energy on primarily online competition and host fewer live events, at least for now, according to a new interview from a Blizzard executive. So they're saying, like, for the time being, that is what we're going to do. And there's a good chance then, if this is true, that some of the layoffs are just kind of we need to cut back for now so that we have more, we can kind of retool the team the way we need it to when we go back to in-person events. But what follows is them saying that Activision Blizzard Esports is set to announce a major restructuring of their operations, according to a Sports Business Journal interview with the president of sports and entertainment at Activision Blizzard, Tony Petitti. I can't believe that's actually his name, or Tony Petitti. I don't actually know how you pronounce it, but regardless. On Tuesday, along with their plans to lay off around 50 employees, Petitti indicated that the esports division is planning to become less dependent on live events. He explained, "We learned a lot last year in terms of how the leagues can be structured for online play, and we'll look to carry forward the best practices from that in terms of timing. It's a reaction to the realities of how the leagues are playing and what resources we need to allocate to best serve the league, owners, teams, and fans." Blizzard clarified with Inven Global that restructuring to be less dependent on live events doesn't mean they won't host live events in the future. They said those events are still part of their long-term strategy. However, they did not specify which live events they intend to keep. Given that they already canceled the homestands for this upcoming season, it's pretty safe to say we won't be seeing those this year. Though technically they did not cancel homestands necessarily for this year. They've part of the reason why they pushed so heavily for teams like the LA Valiant to go to Asia and some of the teams in Asia to go to Asia was because they wanted to be able to potentially host homestands in Asia this year, because Asia will likely have in-person events sooner than in North America, so they wanted to be able to kind of maximize the ability for teams in Asia to get to host some of those events, because the teams in Asia never got to host them. There hasn't been a single Asian homestand yet. All the ones we've had so far were in North America. We were supposed to have them in China and Korea early in the year last season, but that never happened. Then the article kind of goes in talking about how they started hosting homestands in the different cities, that it was the plan for 2020, and then COVID came and it impacted a lot of that stuff. But this article ends saying the Overwatch League placing less emphasis on homestands and live events hardly comes as a surprise to Overwatch League fans who are already preparing for an all-online 4th season starting in April. According to a comment from Blizzard to Invent Global, they will return their emphasis to live events when it becomes feasible to do so. Until then, at least, we can continue to watch online. So these articles will both be linked in the description if you want to see them, but I kind of wanted to just share my thoughts on this whole situation, and I've been doing it as I've been talking about it in general, but my initial reaction is, assuming the layoffs are tied to this restructuring of turning and shifting their focus towards online events. One of the things I believe, if I recall correctly, the Call of Duty League has a kind of like on and off, like a weekly, like every other week system, I think, where it's like each homestand basically is a tournament. So a team gets to host a tournament. And I don't even think the team necessarily has to make that tournament, but the teams will host tournaments, and the qualifiers for that tournament will take place online the week before. Now, I could be wrong. This is something I've heard from people, and I don't watch the CDL, so correct me if I am wrong, because I very much might be. So please let me know in the comments if I am incorrect about this. So there's a good possibility that what we might see from the Overwatch League is a transition to in-person tournaments for the playoffs and for kind of seasonal, like mid-season tournaments, like we have this season with the May Melee, the June Joust, Summer Showdown, Countdown Cup. There's a possibility that we see a movement away from doing homestands every single week, which is what we saw in the past, or what the goal was for 2020, to homestands specifically for tournaments, and then moving them to different places throughout the season. Now, something I know has also been talked about, I believe Monte Cristo has talked about this in the past, was basically saying have kind of circuits. So you basically have homestands in certain like regions of the country at the same time, right? And you kind of have a tournament at the end of that where the teams all have played in those cities, and then there's a tournament, and then you take a bit of a break, you travel them to the next area, and so on and so on. So, for example, right, let's say it's like the NA North circuit, right? So one weekend, you'll have tournaments in London and Paris, right? And then let's say that the teams that compete in London and Paris they compete there for the first week, and then they're off the second week, and then they'll come back the third week. Then in the second week, you have other teams that play. So they play in, say, New York and Boston, and then you have the next week where they play in Toronto, and then either New York or Boston again, and then you have a final tournament in one of those cities at the end of that circuit. Then you take a week off, and then you go to, let's say, a week off, maybe 2 weeks off, but let's say it's a week off, and then you travel to the west coast of the US, and also, Dallas and whatnot, and so maybe you have a Dallas and LA, and then you have San Francisco, Vancouver, and then 2 of those cities again the next week, and then a tournament, take a bit of a break, go to Asia. So you kind of go around and you keep it in the same regions. And so that's how you kind of keep the teams playing, and you keep the homestand model, but you don't have teams traveling as much across the country all the time, where you kind of keep them in the same region generally. You make sure you kind of provide them with kind of a base camp, if you will, right? Like, if you know you're going to be on the West Coast for a while, maybe you have places for the teams in LA, in California somewhere, right? Or in Texas somewhere. And you keep the teams while they're kind of doing this tournament structure. That is something that could be a possibility. But this article, whether or not it's fully true, Blizzard can make their statement all they want. Sometimes it ends up not being necessarily true. They say live events are still a part of their strategy. And I don't think that they have any plan of just gutting live events, right? They still want grand finals to be an in-person event. They still want to be able to have those tournaments in person, I think, whenever they can. But I think what they're coming to say is that the value in having home stands for every single match isn't necessarily as good. And when you think about the fact that there's some teams who have built arenas or who have been invested in building arenas, right? The Toronto Defiant, the Philadelphia Fusion, those are two teams that have very clearly put money into building arenas for their teams. If they can't use those arenas, that's a huge problem. So that for me is the thing that I kind of put my focus on when I think about this situation. The league built its model on in-person events. So if they shift away from in-person events, it doesn't make any sense. And you screw over the organizations, the people who bought into the league. You also screw over a lot of the players who in 2020 talked about the fact that a lot of them really like competing in front of a crowd. Even Uber, in his video he put out, he put it out a couple hours before I'm recording this video, he made a video talking about where he's going to be for 2021. I won't spoil it in case you haven't seen it, but he talked about the fact that when he was casting the grand finals for the Overwatch League in 2020, he had crowd noises playing in his ears because he was like, this is not the same thing that I love to do. There's no people, there's no energy, I don't feel anything, there's no... Right? Homestands are a very, very important part of the Overwatch League, right? They're a very important part of esports in general. You cannot build, in my opinion, you cannot build esports on purely live play. When things happen like a pandemic, sure, right? As kind of a secondary backup plan, sure, that's perfectly fine. Makes sense. But going forward, I don't believe that esports can be built entirely on online play because there are inherent problems with it. And we've seen it a lot with what's been going on in the Call of Duty League recently, and even I think in Valorant to a degree. Lag can be a huge issue. Crashes can be a huge issue. Power outages can be a huge issue. One person's power goes out. Well, if, one person's power goes out, well, that team is at a huge disadvantage because now they have a player whose power is out and everybody else is fine. There was a time of the Dallas Fuel homestand back in 2019 where the whole arena's power went out. But when one player's power goes out, it's very different because it's like, well, this one player can't play, but everybody else can, so either we have to sub somebody in or figure something out. That happened with the Toronto Defiant last year, where Cruz's power went out, and so he wasn't able to play with the rest of the team. So there's a lot of issues that arise with purely online play that you avoid when you have in-person events, but obviously in COVID you can't really do that. So I hope very much that this article doesn't actually suggest and fully come true, and that we will not be having live events going forward. I think live events are very important. I think we need them. I think the laying off of staff is a pretty bad sign for things. It especially with like observers and potentially like live in-person coordinating type of staff. If those are the people you're getting rid of, maybe for 2020 it makes sense to lay off some of those staff who you don't need to be working right here, right now, because you're not going to be having in-person events, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense to have that in-person event planning team around, but you still have to figure out what you're going to do going forward, and I think that laying off some people who probably don't need to be fully laid off, but they are, is the kind of next step, and we'll see what happens. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the situation. I don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes, obviously. If I did, I wouldn't be making a YouTube video on it, most likely, because I'd probably be making pretty good money at Blizzard. So, that is what it is. Some of the stuff in this article is really promising to me. Jacob Wolf, in his article, talks about how the Overwatch League, now that Pete Vlastelica is no longer the commissioner, There are two new people kind of running it, which is Petiti, who I mentioned before, but also Joanna Ferries, who is a former NFL vice president. And she's actually done a lot of things because whereas people like Pete Listelica and some of these other people who've come into the esports scene have kind of ignored the opinions of esports executives and pros and professionals in the field, she's actually listened, she's taken notes, taken feedback, and she looks to them for help when she doesn't actually know what she's talking about. And when you have people like them in charge who are listening, people like John Spector, who's in a very powerful position where he is kind of the spokesman and he does a lot of the things to push the league forward. I think we see the future potential for the league to actually benefit from people who will actually do the things that they need to do to make the Overwatch League better. 2021 is a huge year. In-person events probably won't happen very often, so 2022 is when to expect those things to happen, but 2021 is still big, because if they can figure out a system that works and then pivot that to in-person once we get the ability to do that going into 2022 potentially, or the end of 2021, very kind of bright-eyed version of it, I think that would be really, really good to see. But for the time being, we will just have to wait and see what happens, see if we get teams that can have live events, whether it be in Asia or North America. But this is an interesting story, and it's a very interesting time that we're in right now, seeing the way the Overwatch League is developing. So let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments down below. Like I said, these articles are in the description if you want to check them out. But that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. But I'm going to get out of here. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.